We're going to continue to do a heart check this morning. I have a question for you. Can you think of any words that you weren't allowed to say growing up, but you used other words to kind of mean the same word, but you just didn't say it and you didn't get your mouth washed out with soap? Can you think of those words that you might have used? We call them maybe a euphemism. It's a mild or indirect way or word of expressing something that is substituted for one that is considered to be too harsh. Maybe you can think of a word. I don't know if you've ever followed Tim Hawkins. He's someone that is a funny Christian comedian that talks about marriage, homeschooling, and parenting. But he has a bunch of cuss words that I think are relatively funny. They're funny because I've used them. I still use some of them, and maybe you do too. So these are words that he remembers hearing over his lifetime, some that he's used, and maybe some of these will relate to you. So please understand, this does have to do with the message and where we're going this morning. So here's a few of them. Shucks, rats, shizzle, toot, crapola, holy moly, holy guacamole, holy smokes, fiddlesticks, fiddle faddle, horse patootie, phooey, shut the front door, cripes, good gravy, good grief, great googly moogly, H-E double hockey sticks. Anyone use that one? Bleep, son of a biscuit, for heaven's sake, for the love of Pete, for Pete's sake, Pete gets in there a lot, for crying out loud, jumpin' Jehoshaphat, razza fraza, razza fraza, crud, mother of pearl, farfanoogan, what the hey, jeepers, geez Louise, Louise is here, sheesh, gosh, what the what, ticked off, shoot, dang. Now these are funny. Dad burn it, dag nabbit, dag gone it, dag gummit, cotton pickin', and heavens to Betsy. Anyone use any of those? All right. I think there's a few more. That's all I could get in one breath there, but maybe you remember using some of these. But if you were a Christian growing up in a Christian home, you would probably use some words like that to replace the real cuss words that you weren't allowed to say because you know for a fact it would have got your mouth washed out with soap. I remember being with my friends in grade 8. One of my good friends was one that we would have over for dinner, and he knew my family really well. He knew that at supper time we would pray before we eat. We would actually read the Bible when we were done every night. And we used to have a sign that goes on the door that says, "We're eating, so don't interrupt this because this is family time." Sometimes he would be with us, and he didn't join in that. But I remember being in grade 8. I was with my friends. He was there. We were angry, and I actually said the real F word. And it was really interesting because he turned to look at me. This is grade 8. He turned to look at me, and he goes, "Boland, you don't swear." And I was just really embarrassed because he knows that I don't use that type of language. And isn't it interesting when you're at work and you may use some of those cuss words instead of the real word? Don't you get looked at kind of funny? Isn't it only take a little bit of time before the people who hang around you at work start to realize that you're not participating in that kind of language and makes them feel kind of uncomfortable? I don't know about you, but we use fake cuss words sometimes to keep us from saying what's really in our hearts. And this is where we're going this morning. We're substituting something that's really in our hearts so that it doesn't sound as bad coming out of our mouths. Now, rules are there to prevent people from breaking laws. And thousands of years ago, there were certain religious leaders that made a career out of making these laws or these rules to keep you from breaking the primary rule or law. And so by the time Jesus arrived on the scene, Jesus comes to this time that Jesus is living, or Jesus comes to the time where the Pharisees are really trying to keep the law. And they're doing it in a way where they've made a whole bunch of these other rules. And maybe you're familiar with this, but there was 500 by the time Jesus came in on the scene. 500 rules that they've added to the law handed down to Moses. These were called the tradition of the elders. Is that familiar to you? The tradition of the elders. And its sole purpose was to prevent people from breaking the primary rule that Moses had handed down. So here's an example. On the Sabbath, there was a rule that said you could not take part in any type of commerce on the Sabbath. And so this led to a clause which restricted any type of handling of money on the Sabbath. And this would ensure that no one would actually break the rule that says to not work on the Sabbath. And so the Sabbath law, which prohibited work, now has been added on with all these other laws. I want to give you some today that still are in existence today. Obviously, some of them that I'm going to read wouldn't have been back then because they weren't invented yet, but some are like this. Opening an umbrella on the Sabbath is considered work. Tearing toilet paper in a restroom. So I guess you have to prepare ahead of time so that you're not tearing any toilet paper. Running. You cannot cut your nails. You can't use a telephone. Squeezing orange juice is considered work. Taking an object from a private domain into a public domain. I still don't have that one completely figured out. If anyone wants to let me know about that later, you can. Brushing your teeth is considered work. You can't braid anything. You can't apply body lotion. Turning off a light switch or on a light switch was considered work. So you can see where these laws just continue to progress, all in trying to keep the one main law, which was to not work on the Sabbath. So over time, the religious leaders had assigned these extra rules or traditions of the elders, and they held them in equality to the law of Moses. When Jesus comes in on the scene, he paid very little attention to their traditions. And that's what got him into a little bit of trouble. While he and his disciples observed the Mosaic law, Jesus seemed to go out of his way to violate the man-made laws of the Jews. So the Gospels are filled with accounts of these religious authorities pointing out these violations in Jesus and when he's with his disciples. Now, I want to give some credit to the Pharisees. The Pharisees, I believe their heart, for a lot of them, was right. What they wanted to do is protect people from breaking the law. And so they worked very vigorously. I think for some, they expected that the Messiah would come if they got all the laws right. And so they put laws on top of laws. But the gospel are filled with a lot of these religious authorities trying to point out to Jesus and his disciples which ones they're getting wrong. How could this man, they would say, claim to be a spokesperson for God if he is not even keeping our traditions? And so let's look at one today. Let's kind of dig into the scripture here. This is in the Gospel of Matthew. It's an incident that happened and it got Jesus into a lot of hot water, so to speak. Maybe this rule was in your house. Did you have to wash your hands before you eat? It's a good rule. It's a good rule. But Jesus decided not to wash his hands before he ate. And so as disciples, followers of Jesus, they do what their master does, and they didn't wash their hands either. And so because the disciples do everything their master does, the Pharisees are now asking Jesus a question about why are your disciples not washing their hands before they eat? Because according to the tradition of the elders, everybody was supposed to wash their hands from their elbows to the tips of their fingers before they ate. It's kind of like a doctor that goes in for surgery, right? That's what they were expecting. This tradition that went beyond hygiene. This wasn't just about washing your hands because it's a good thing to do. This was because it would keep you ceremonially clean. And so what they would do is they would wash their hands because what they didn't want to happen was for them to touch anything unclean and to actually put it into their mouths. They didn't even want to touch something that maybe had been accidentally made unclean. So they would have kosher rules and laws of what to eat and what not to eat. But they didn't even want to touch anything unclean. So the religious leaders make it a standard of righteousness equal to the law of Moses. On Wednesday nights, we've been talking about just the history of the church, and there was a phrase that's been used: action plus time equals law. You can say tradition plus time equals law. That's why you get all these traditions added on to one another. Soon enough, they become law. Can you think of anything that maybe within the church that has taken precedence in our time and place as well? But Jesus ignored this rule. He didn't insist that his followers apply it either. And so here's how the whole thing went down. This is in your Bibles in Matthew chapter 15 is where we pick up the story. It says, some Pharisees and teachers of the religious law now arrived from Jerusalem to see Jesus. They asked him, "Why do your disciples disobey our age-old tradition? For they ignore our tradition of ceremonial hand washing before they eat." So here's the Pharisees looking to find out what people are doing wrong, and they're calling Jesus out on it. They're standing in the presence of a man who can heal the sick, who can calm the seas with his voice, and they are in a panic because he does not wash his hands and his disciples do not wash their hands before meals. Now, if you remember from last week, Jesus is the master at asking questions. Jesus' response to their question is with a question. He's very wise this way. So in verse 3, "And why do you, by your traditions, violate the direct commandments of God?" Jesus turns this right back on them. And Jesus is trying to get to the heart of the matter here. And the Pharisees accuse Jesus of ignoring the rules that they added onto their law. And Jesus then accuses them of breaking the real law. And they break these laws in order to keep all their traditions. And they didn't like that too much. It's not long before Jesus actually gets into this heart check mini sermon with them. This is where he calls them hypocrites. This is where he says and accuses them of nullifying the word of God for the sake of their homemade traditions. And Jesus now just kind of leans into them and he leaves them speechless. As soon as he finishes with the Pharisees, though, he now turns to his disciples. And his disciples are probably in the corner thinking, "Oh my goodness, there goes Jesus again. He's throwing the Pharisees under the bus." But now he turns to his disciples. And a little later on in Matthew 15, verse 17, he says, "Don't you see," he's talking to his disciples, "that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and then out of the body?" I like how the NLT puts it. Anything you eat passes through the stomach and then goes into the sewer. Okay, for us today, we'll do a different translation. That whatever enters a person's mouth will ultimately pass through the body and into the toilet. Does that make a little bit more sense in our culture today? I'm sure by now Jesus has their undivided attention. Listen to what he says next. He says, "But the words you speak come from the heart. That's what defiles you." We sang a song just a minute ago about listen to our hearts. Listen to our hearts. And that's what we're going to kind of do today. We're just going to do a heart check. The words you speak come from the heart. That's what defiles you. So Jesus is making a point here. God isn't nearly as concerned about what goes into your mouths as he is about what comes out of your mouth. Do we understand? Now Jesus is saying that God was more offended by what came out than what went in. But this would have been a phrase that would have caught the disciples' attention. When it comes to a heart check, this reveals a lot about risk factors in our own lives. That things that come out of a person's mouth come from the heart. Did Jesus really mean this? Did Jesus really mean that what comes out of our mouths is actually coming from a place inside our hearts? And I'm sure if you're like me, there's been many times where you've said something. Have you ever stopped and just said, "Where did that come from?" Have you caught yourself? Is there any time in your life where you wish you didn't say something? Why is that? Because it comes from within, and it comes from our hearts. But it gets even worse. It gets even worse. Jesus goes on to say that the heart is responsible not only for our words, but now for our actions as well. Here's what he says in verse 19 and 20. For from the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, all sexual immorality, theft, lying, and slander. These are what defile you. Eating with unwashed hands will never defile you. Evil thoughts. I thought these originated in my mind. Jesus is saying it goes a little bit deeper, goes into our hearts. And all the time that I'm thinking that all I'm just doing is saying something, actually he's saying it's coming from our heart, and we need to do a heart check. But not only is it coming from our hearts and they're just words, they turn into actions, because everything on this list becomes an action that we do. They're deeds, behaviors, and they all come from the heart. This is why the proverb writer says this in verse 23, above all else, to guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Notice how it doesn't say everything you say flows from it. It's everything you do. So somehow what's in our hearts, either good or bad, is even eventually translated into words and deeds. And that's kind of a bit scary. So let's just kind of get practical today for a moment. We're just going to get really practical here, and we're going to talk about 4 risk factors. These risk factors, I believe we all wrestle with them in one way or another. Here they are: guilt, anger, greed, and jealousy. These are risk factors to our heart. And I believe if we really look at it, most of us are all wrestling with this in some way or another. Guilt, anger, greed, and jealousy. Now, if you've ever owed somebody some money before, you'll understand this. Don't you know this to be true? If you owe someone money for something, there is always this debt-to-debtor kind of a relationship that you have. Isn't it always, there's always 2 ways to resolve this tension within a relationship. It's either someone's going to have to pay up or some debt is going to have to be forgiven. But as long as the debt is unpaid or unforgiven, the debt will always control the relationship. Here's a quote that I think helps. Our actions will eventually reflect our hearts. See, our words, they come out, but eventually they end up being what we do, and they're going to reflect our true hearts. So is there anyone here that wishes that maybe you could just have a do-over in a situation? Maybe you said something that you regret. Maybe you reacted in a way that you wish you didn't. Maybe you weren't willing to let go of something that now you look back and you just think, what was I holding on to that for so tightly? Maybe you wish you could go back in time and do something different, but you realize your heart was controlled by one of these 4 risk factors. Now, just to promote a book by Andy Stanley, it's called Enemies of the Heart. This is where a lot of this information comes from, and it's found it really, really helpful. It's called Enemies of the Heart. I recommend it to anyone that is dealing with a lot of these issues in your life. The reason that these are dangerous and that these are risk factors in our life and that they're warning signs and we need to start paying attention is because if you don't deal with them, sooner or later, it will eventually make its way to the outside. And it's going to leak all over your relationships. And you're going to end up hurting not only yourself, but someone else. But not only does this hurt people you love, it also hurts God. And it's offensive to God because he loves the people that you hate or that you hurt. And God loves you even though he doesn't, but he doesn't like to see the people hurt that you're hurting. So this is why we need to deal with these 4 things. So let's just take a look at guilt here for a moment. How many times have we been guilted into something? How often do we guilt others into doing something for us? Guilt has a way of dividing. Here's how we combat guilt. Guilt says, I owe you. So we have to recognize this. With guilt, it says, I owe you an apology. I've hurt you. I know I have. But my tension is to hide. My tension is to run away. I took something from you. I owe you something. And my heart is filled with guilt because every time I see you, I'm reminded that I owe you something. So guilt leads to walls. It leads to criticism. Guilt leads to dishonesty. It leads to hiding, and guilt leads to keeping secrets and keeping distance. Have you ever felt this way before? Maybe you feel this way now with somebody in your life, a relationship that you have. If you deal with anger, anger says, you owe me. That's why there's always this debt-to-debtor relationship. Anger says, you owe me. And when we get angry, it's because we didn't get what we want or what we think we deserve. I want you to think about a time when you were really, really angry in your life. Isn't it because in that entire situation was reduced to this simple idea, is that you didn't get what you think you deserve? Somebody owed you something, and you didn't get it. Someone took something from you. And so you either pay me back, or I'll pay you back. And the risk factor with anger is that it doesn't stay just between you and the other person. Anger leaks, and it leaks into all your other relationships. Then there's greed. Greed says, I owe me. I owe me. What's mine is mine, and I've earned it, and I've got a lot more coming. And so greed assumes that it's for us to consume. And unlike anger or guilt, these things you can hide pretty good. But greed, you can't hide all that well. People notice. But the thing with greed is that it actually can be kind of hidden in virtues, things that are good. See, greedy people are often savers, and saving is a good thing. Greedy people are often planners, and planner is a good thing. Being a planner is a good thing. Greedy people want to make sure their financial future is all in order, and that's a good thing. Greed is easy to hide from ourselves, but it's interesting how it's not that easy to hide from others. Greedy people are not cheerful givers. Greedy people are reluctant to share. Greedy people talk as if they have just enough to get by. And greedy people won't let you forget that you owe them something. They won't even let you forget what they've done for you. Greedy people are reluctant to express gratitude. Greedy people aren't content with what they have. And greedy people, the truth is, you can have lots of money and be greedy, and you can have hardly any money and still be greedy. Because greed isn't a financial situation or issue, it's a heart issue. Here's a test for you. When someone is in need, are you more inclined to say, my heart goes out to them, but my money does not? Because greed says, I owe me. Jealousy says, life owes me. So I was in line for that promotion, and I didn't get it. They didn't even consider me. I have more experience, I have more skills, but I wasn't even considered for that job. And now I have an attitude to all my coworkers because they must have been all in on it. Now, I don't trust anybody that I work with anymore, and I'm done giving it my best because it's just not worth it. This is where jealousy comes in. Life owes me. You may experience this if you ever have been part of a family where there's been a lot of tension over the years. And then mom and dad pass away, and then the will is being read. And the family gets together to hear the will. Oh, and you didn't get what you deserve. There's where jealousy can come in and really wreck our hearts. And this is a risk factor in our lives. You know that you are jealous when you find yourself secretly celebrating someone else's loss or failure. Have you ever done that? And if that is you, or if that is me, then that is a risk factor in our hearts. So how do we respond to these risk factors? Well, guilt says, I owe you. So the best thing that we can do for our hearts is to confess. To confess. Confession that heals and a confession that deals with our guilt will always have a better outcome than us running around being guilty all the time and not confronting the person that we owe. Now, for many of us, I've heard this a lot, but I just need to confess it to God. But the thing here is that God already knows. But the person that you have hurt, that you know you've hurt, it will go a lot better for you if you go to them and just confess and say, I'm sorry. So you can confess to God, but He already knows. And the longer you carry that guilt, you actually do more damage to yourself and to your heart. That's why guilt is such a risk factor when it comes to our hearts. And confessing helps us to swallow our pride. When we're angry, you owe me. What's the best thing to do in this case? Is to forgive. Forgiveness is identifying specifically what was taken from you and deciding that you do not owe me anymore. What specifically was taken from you? This is tough for a lot of people, forgiveness, because this has so many levels to it. There are so many things that make us angry, and sometimes when things were done to us sexually or things were done within a family and it's a mom and dad issue, these things are really, really difficult. So I'm not trying to take this lightly in any means. But what specifically was taken from you? Identify it and make a decision that the debt is canceled in your life. And it's going to feel like you're letting them off the hook. And it's true. That's why it hurts so bad. But let me say this. There's someone else that you're letting off the hook as well. And it's you. Carrying around guilt and anger for something that has hurt us in the past, if we cannot learn to forgive, we're only hurting ourselves. And that's why it's a risk factor in our lives. Forgiveness allows you to let go of all the stuff that weighs heavy in your hearts and eventually paralyzes you. Unforgiveness makes you bitter, and it eventually leaks all over your relationships. And I'm sure some of us have felt that in the past. I am deciding that what you owe me has been forgiven. And then greed, if you got a sneak peek when I messed up earlier, it's give. We add a few extra dollars to our generosity. Make a decision to say, greed is not going to control my wallet anymore. If there is something or someone that is in need, find something that you own, that you bought in greed, sell it, and give the money away. That's a good test. If you want to be free of greed, we need to become generous, and we need to give. And if what you own is controlling you, Jesus says to give it away. Jesus is not just against us having stuff. That's not what He's against at all. Jesus wants to bless us. But when it comes to being the primary thing that we are always after, and we put that over serving people, and we keep it to ourselves instead of providing to those in need, we have a greed problem. Do you know that in Sodom and Gomorrah, the whole story of Sodom and Gomorrah, the major problem wasn't sexual immorality. In Ezekiel, verses 16, 49 through 50, it says what the problem was. You know what the problem was? Lack of hospitality. But they did not help the poor and needy. There is nothing that angers God's heart more than his people not taking care of those in need. God will always find someone to provide for his children, and we need to do that. Jealousy, life owes me. How do we combat that? Actually, the problem with this one is that it's not that life owes us. It's actually that God owes us. See, for a lot of us, what happens is that God didn't come through the way we had hoped. When we make a decision, this is the way we combat it. When we make a decision to accept God's lot in our life, and we glorify God with what he's given us, we will get over our jealousy. We will stop comparing our lives to everybody else's. We will take what God has given and use it to the best of our ability to bless others. Now, I have learned this through watching other Christians who suffered well, and maybe you have too. There's always someone in the world that's suffering more than whatever we're going through. But I've watched Christians suffer well. And what really strikes me in that is that they didn't allow whatever they were going through to make them bitter. They didn't compare their lives to others. And somehow they found a way to offer God and glorify God in their suffering. And aren't they the ones, typically, that we end up having the most respect for? When you know someone who's going through such a difficult time, and yet God is still getting the glory in their life. They are the ones that say, God, what can I do with what you have given me so that I can turn bless others? And sometimes you see this demonstrated with people who are homeless on the street. I don't know if you've seen any of these videos or TikTok videos, but it always surprises me. There's people that are doing some kind of staged thing where they're watching homeless, and they're going to give maybe a homeless person some money or some food vouchers, and you watch some of these people, and they'll go around and they'll turn and bless their other homeless friends and neighbors. That doesn't happen all the time, but you can see sometimes where what happens. But then they go and they interview this homeless person again and say, why did you do that? And they would always just say, hey, I've been given a blessing. I can now go use that to go bless others. I don't know. There's something about that just really gets to the heart of the issue. But how do we respond to jealousy in our lives? We celebrate. You will conquer over jealousy when you learn to celebrate what God has given you, and you celebrate what God has given others. This is really difficult because when someone else gets something that you wish you had or that you think you deserve, you're going to write a letter and just say, hey, from the bottom of my heart, I just want to say congratulations. I hope you do really well with this new position, with this new job that you have. We celebrate. Yeah, Bruce, but I'm not feeling it. I don't get that. I just don't have it in my heart. But the thing is that celebrating doesn't mean you have to feel like celebrating, but you can actually behave yourself into a place of healing in your heart when you celebrate. See, there's certain risk factors that we all need to be on the lookout for, and it's guilt, anger, greed, and jealousy. And these all rip at our hearts, and everything about them leak into our other relationships. And God wants us to have a healthy heart. So are any of these risk factors in your life? Is there someone that you are feeling guilty about, that you know you owe an apology to? Maybe it's time to confess. Is there someone that you're angry with right now in your life? Where they owe you something. Maybe they owe you an apology. Or maybe they owe you some money. Or maybe they owe you a coffee and a relationship together where you can sit down and just work some things out. Maybe it's time to forgive. And if we're greedy, if it's life is all about I owe me, maybe it's time to start being generous. And if we're jealous, maybe it's just time to bless others with what God has given us. And make a decision. God doesn't owe me anything, because what he gave was the perfect gift of his son. So, like Jesus asked the lame man last week, crazy question, as he's been an invalid for 38 years. He asked, do you want to get well? Today I ask, how's your heart? Do you want to get well? Do you want to get well? I just got to say this, speak from my heart. I find these very difficult, if I'm honest. I find these really difficult. So if that's the way you're feeling today, you're in good company. These aren't easy. But I would really encourage you to find someone close in your life that you can talk about these things with and really try to do a heart check. Because if we don't deal with these risk factors, what happens is our arteries get clogged. We're eventually not going to only hurt ourselves, we're going to hurt others.